The dust rose behind them like smoke signals announcing death. 3 riders came at sundown, silhouettes against the fading light, their horses moving with the slow certainty of men who knew their business. Martha Crane stood alone on her porch, one hand resting on the weathered rail, her body still as the cottonwood that grew beside the house. She'd watched them coming for the last mile, tracking their approach across the open grassland that stretched from her fence line to the horizon. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? The wind pushed through the dry grass, carrying the smell of sage and coming night. Leather creaked. Spurs jingled. The horses stopped 50 feet out, and the 3 men dismounted with the practiced economy of riders who'd done this before. The lead man wore a deputy's badge pinned crooked on his vest, the metal catching the last of the golden light. He was younger than the other 2, maybe 30, with the kind of lean build that came from living hard and traveling light. His companions spread wide without being told, positioning themselves 45 degrees apart in a formation Martha recognized instantly. Crossfire. Classic intimidation. She didn't move, didn't speak, just watched with the stillness of someone who'd already made her decision and was waiting for them to make theirs. The deputy took his time walking forward, his right hand drifting down to loosen the holster at his hip. The movement was casual, practiced, meant to be noticed. 20 feet away now, close enough to see Martha's face in the dying light, the lines at her eyes, the gray threading through dark hair pulled back in a simple bun. Close enough to see she was alone. Close enough to mistake her silence for fear. "Mrs. Crane," he said, his voice carrying the flat authority of men who hide behind badges. "Name's Cole Hendricks. I'm here on behalf of the county regarding unpaid tax obligations on this property." Martha said nothing. Behind Hendricks, one of his men spat a stream of tobacco juice and grinned. The other kept his hand near his gun, eyes scanning the windows of the house. "You got until sunrise tomorrow to vacate," Hendricks continued. "Legal papers have been filed. Your time's up." Still she didn't speak. Her hand remained on the porch rail, 6 inches from a cloth-wrapped bundle she'd placed there an hour before they arrived. The wind tugged at the edges of the fabric. Hendricks took another step. His hand hovered near his pistol grip, fingers flexing. Some men mistake patience for weakness. Those men don't live long enough to learn the difference. "You understand what I'm telling you?" Hendricks' voice had taken on an edge. "Come sunrise, you ain't here, or you are here and we have to move you. Either way, this land ain't yours no more." The silence stretched. Hendricks' jaw tightened. The man on the left shifted his weight, nervous energy making him dangerous. "Your husband ain't here to protect you no more, old woman," Hendricks said. The words hung in the air like gun smoke. Martha's eyes, hazel, steady, unblinking, met his. The question hung between them in the purple light of dusk. Would she back down, or would she make him regret crossing that line? But to understand what happened next, you need to know where this started. Montana Territory, 1884. The town of Stillwater Bend sat in a valley where 3 creeks converged, creating a ribbon of green in an otherwise harsh landscape. Martha Crane had lived on her ranch for 32 years, arriving as a bride of 23 when the land was still being contested by Crow hunting parties and claim jumpers who figured a piece of paper from Washington meant nothing compared to a faster gun. The Crane Ranch wasn't much to look at. 240 acres of grazing land, a modest house, a barn that leaned slightly north from decades of wind. But a clear creek ran through the heart of the property, and water meant everything. Martha and Jacob had built the place with their own hands, prying stones from the creek bed to build the foundation, cutting timber from the mountains, surviving winters that killed cattle and summers that dried the grassland to tinder. Jacob Crane had died 8 months earlier. Pneumonia, the doctor said, though Martha knew it was the accumulated weight of 3 decades working this land. He was buried on a hillside overlooking the creek, under a simple stone marker she'd carved herself. No fancy words, just his name and the years. That was how Jacob would have wanted it. The townspeople knew Martha as a woman who kept to herself. Once a month she rode into Stillwater Bend for supplies, flour, sugar, ammunition, salt. She paid cash, spoke little, and returned to her ranch the same day. She was capable in the way frontier women had to be, able to birth a calf, or put down a lame horse, or patch a roof before the winter snows came. But there were whispers. Old Pete, who ran the livery, remembered that Martha could ride before she married Jacob, that she could shoot too, hitting targets most men missed. She'd come from somewhere back east, Kansas, maybe, or Missouri, with no family she'd discuss and a past she'd buried as deliberately as she'd buried her maiden name. Jacob had once told the bartender, after his third whiskey, that Martha had a life before this one, and it wasn't soft. But Jacob was a man who kept confidences, and he never said more than that. The land syndicate had arrived the previous spring, backed by railroad money and Eastern investors who saw the future running on steel rails and telegraph wires. They wanted the Creek Valley, wanted to control the water that would make their enterprise profitable. They bought out 3 ranches already, using debt collection and legal manipulation, buying judges and clerks, twisting the law into whatever shape served their purpose. Martha's ranch was the last holdout. She owned her land free and clear, had the papers to prove it, and made no secret she had no intention of selling. So the syndicate sent Cole Hendricks, a hired gun wearing a bought badge, to finish the job. Hendricks had killed 2 men in shootings he called lawful, both while serving eviction notices. He wasn't stupid. He was dangerous, professional, and backed by men who believed money could solve any problem, including stubborn widows. But did Hendricks know who he was really facing? 2 weeks before that sunset confrontation, the pressure campaign began in earnest. A surveyor crew arrived without permission, planting stakes across Martha's grazing pasture, running chains, and taking measurements as if the land already belonged to someone else. When Martha rode out to confront them, the crew boss, a bulky man named Taggart with hands like ham hocks, handed her an eviction notice. The paper claimed she owed back taxes in an amount that would have bankrupted her twice over. The signature was forged, the debt fabricated, but when Martha rode to town and challenged it at the land office, the clerk looked at her with the dead eyes of a man who'd already sold his conscience. The debt was legal, he said, due in 30 days. 2 nights later, someone cut her fence line and drove off a dozen head of cattle. Martha found the fence post splintered, the wire curled back like broken fingers. She spent a full day repairing the damage, knowing it was a message, not theft. They wanted her to understand they could bleed her dry without ever facing her directly. The next week, her water trough was poisoned. She found 3 steers dead, bloated in the sun, flies thick as smoke around their carcasses. The cruelty of it burned in her chest. Good animals killed for no reason except to demonstrate power. She buried them far from the house and said nothing to anyone. Then, 5 days before Friday, Hendricks came alone. He sat his horse outside her gate and delivered the final terms. Vacate by Friday sundown, or he'd return with a writ of seizure and enough men to enforce it. How many men? Martha asked, her first words in the entire conversation. Hendricks smiled, taking the question as proof of her fear. Enough. He didn't ask questions, didn't search the property, didn't notice the way Martha's eyes tracked his holster, the high-cut cavalry rig, tied down low on his thigh, the leather worn smooth where his hand had practiced the draw 10,000 times. He saw an old widow, alone, with no allies and no options. He asked if she understood. She said she did, but they weren't understanding the same thing. After Hendricks rode away, Martha didn't pray, didn't pack. She walked to the barn, moved a stack of hay bales that hadn't been touched in years, and opened a trunk she'd sealed 30 years ago with the same finality a person might seal a coffin. Inside were the pieces of a life she'd chosen to end, a pair of custom Colt peacemakers with walnut grips, engraved with scrollwork that caught the lamplight, a gun belt, hand-tooled leather with initials worked into the design, MEK, and a faded poster, the kind that used to hang outside saloons and opera houses from Dodge City to Sacramento. Before she was Martha Crane, she was May Kellerman. In the 1870s, May had been one of 3 sharpshooters traveling with Colonel Beaumont's Wild West exhibition, a show that brought the frontier to Eastern audiences hungry for spectacle and adventure. She'd perform trick shots for paying crowds, shooting lit cigarettes from volunteers' mouths, shattering glass balls thrown in the air, putting 6 shots through a playing card while riding at full gallop. She wasn't an outlaw, but she was famous in certain circles. Fast, accurate, fearless. The crowds loved her. She met Jacob Crane at a show in Bozeman. He'd been in the front row, a quiet rancher with kind eyes who'd stayed after the show to tell her she was remarkable. But he'd seen past the costume and the applause to the woman who was tired of performing, tired of being a spectacle, tired of living out of trunks and sleeping in different towns. He'd offered her something else, a life built on land that didn't move, work that mattered, peace that ran deeper than applause. She'd retired the next month, married him that spring, and buried May Kellerman along with the guns. But the skills never left. Muscle memory doesn't fade, it just waits. Over the next 3 days, Martha prepared with clinical precision. She cleaned and oiled the Colts, working the action until it moved like water, checking the balance, the sights, the trigger pull. The guns remembered her hands, and her hands remembered the guns. 30 years vanished in the time it took to draw. She walked her property, counting steps, measuring distances, noting sight lines and cover positions. She moved furniture inside the house, table near the window, chair position for an angle on the porch. She rehearsed the draw at dawn and dusk, when the light would match Friday sundown, until the motion became as natural as breathing. Martha wasn't preparing to survive. She was preparing to win. She knew Hendricks would bring at least 2 men, probably 3. She knew they'd spread for crossfire. Men who'd done this before always did. She knew they'd underestimate her until the moment it was too late, and by then, underestimation would be the last mistake they ever made. On Thursday night, she visited Jacob's grave as the sun set over the mountains. She stood before the simple stone marker for a long time, then spoke aloud for the first time since his death. "I'm sorry," she said. "Sorry for bringing the past back. But I won't let them take what we built." The wildflowers she'd planted around his grave moved in the wind, purple and yellow against the gray stone. Jacob didn't answer. The dead never do. But Martha felt certain he'd understand. He'd always understood her. The question that remained was whether a woman in her 50s, even one with legendary skills, could outdraw 3 younger men who'd killed before. Friday would answer that question. Friday arrived with a sky the color of brass. Martha woke before dawn, dressed in the same simple clothes she wore for ranch work, and placed the match Colts on the porch rail wrapped in cloth. Then she waited. The riders came at sundown, exactly as she'd known they would. Hendricks in the center, flanked by 2 hired guns whose names she'd later learn were Frank Dobbs and Ray Tully. They dismounted 50 feet out and spread into their triangle, Dobbs to the left at 40 feet, Tully to the right at 45, Hendricks center at 30. "Last chance, Mrs. Crane," Hendricks called. "Walk away, and nobody gets hurt." "I'm not leaving," Martha said. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. Hendricks shook his head. "You got no choice. You're alone, old woman. I got the law. I got the men. You got nothing." Martha reached for the cloth bundle. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried. She unwrapped the Colts and let the cloth fall. Hendricks froze. For the first time, doubt flickered across his face. Something was wrong. The widow wasn't crying or begging. She was standing with 2 pistols in her hands like she'd been born with them there. Dobbs saw the guns and panicked. His hand dropped fast, reaching for his holster. That was the trigger. The next 4 seconds determined who would live and who would die. Martha drew both Colts in a crossbody motion, as smooth as silk sliding over stone. Her left hand came up first, firing at Dobbs before his barrel cleared leather. The shot took him center mass, the impact spinning him sideways. He dropped without firing. She pivoted right, the motion fluid, no wasted movement. Tully was halfway into his draw when her second shot caught him in the shoulder, the bullet punching through muscle and bone. He screamed and went down, his gun falling from nerveless fingers. Hendricks was fast. He cleared leather and got a shot off, the crack of his pistol splitting the evening air. But Martha was already moving, dropping into a slight crouch. His bullet splintered the porch post 6 inches from her head, splinters flying. Her third shot took Hendricks high in the chest. He stood for a moment, looking down at the spreading red stain, then fell backward into the dust. For seconds, 3 men down. The powder smoke drifted in the still air, acrid and thick. Martha's left arm burned where Hendricks' bullet had grazed her, and the webbing between her right thumb and forefinger had split from the recoil of the old Colts. Blood ran down her sleeve. Her hands shook from adrenaline, but she was standing. Dobbs and Hendricks were dead. Tully was alive, screaming, trying to crawl toward his horse with one working arm. Martha stepped off the porch, kicked the guns away from the bodies, and stood over Tully. "Ride back," she said. "Tell them what happened here." Tully looked up at her with eyes white with terror and pain. He nodded frantically, unable to speak. Martha walked to his horse, led it to him, and helped him mount despite his wound. Some drew fast. She drew faster. And in the space between fast and faster, men die. Tully rode east, slumped over his saddle, leaving a trail of blood drops in the dust. Martha watched until he disappeared, then turned to look at the 2 bodies in her yard. The evening wind pushed the powder smoke away, leaving only silence and the smell of blood soaking into Montana soil. Martha buried Hendricks and Dobbs the next morning in a far corner of her property, well away from Jacob's grave. She dug the holes herself, working slowly because of her wounded arm. No markers, no prayers, just dirt covering the men who tried to take what wasn't theirs. Tully made it back to Stillwater Bend and told his story to everyone who'd listen. By morning, the whole town knew. The Telegraph carried the news to Helena by afternoon. The syndicate's response came 3 days later, but not with guns. A lawyer arrived from Helena in a press suit, nervous sweat staining his collar despite the cool morning. He carried papers that cleared up the unfortunate tax misunderstanding and withdrew all claims on Martha's property. He apologized for the regrettable confusion and left quickly, refusing even a glass of water. The syndicate dealt in intimidation and legal manipulation, not public gunfights with women who killed deputy marshals. Tully's story spread like wildfire, and newspapers as far as Denver picked it up. The syndicate couldn't afford the scrutiny or the reputation damage. They moved on to easier targets, and the remaining ranchers in the valley kept their land. Martha lived on a ranch for another 12 years, working the land alone until arthritis made it impossible to ride or do the heavy work. In 1896, she sold the property to a young couple for a fair price, enough to buy a small house in Stillwater Bend and live modestly. The Colts went back into the trunk. She never fired them again. The town's relationship with her changed after that Friday. People spoke to her with a mix of respect and wariness, the way you might approach a mountain lion that's chosen to sit peacefully in the sun. Some saw her as a hero who stood up to corruption. Others saw her as a killer who brought violence to their quiet valley. Martha seemed to care about neither judgment. She kept to herself, attended church on Sundays, and never spoke about what happened that day. If anyone asked, she'd look at them with those steady hazel eyes and say nothing until they looked away. Martha Crane died in 1903 at the age of 72. The funeral was small, a handful of townspeople, the young couple who'd bought her ranch, the minister. As they lowered her coffin, someone placed a pair of wildflowers on the lid, purple and yellow, the same kind that grew on Jacob's grave. Martha Crane wasn't a gunfighter looking for glory. She was a woman who wanted peace and build a life around it. But when men tried to take that peace by force, she became May Kellerman one last time and reminded them why she'd been a legend. The cost was real. 2 men dead by her hand, blood on her land, and 12 more years lived in a kind of quiet exile from the life she'd built. But the ranch survived. The land stayed hers until she chose to leave it. And maybe that's what frontier justice looked like. Not clean, not easy, but earned. The creek still runs clear through what was once the Crane Ranch. Old-timers in Stillwater Bend still tell the story of the widow who outdrew 3 killers before they could touch their guns. They tell it because it happened, because witnesses saw the aftermath, because Tully lived to confirm it. They tell it because it's true and because it matters. Some lines, once drawn, don't get crossed.